Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcode.com, and you are listening to Web Dev 101. And in this podcast, what I'd like to talk about is less about any particular technology, but more about the web developer hiring process. Because this is always a hot topic. A lot of people always feel like, and this I think goes like in any industry, always people feel like the hiring process is unfair. Um, and in a sense, hiring processes are. This just really isn't a good way to just predict the future, how well someone will fit in at a company until they're there. The problem is there's a lot of like risks and opportunity costs in doing so. So the purpose of this like episode is to kind of really help like understand, because whether the process is fair or not, if you understand sort of like you understand it, then it's easier to be successful in the process. Okay, because basically being a developer is a very different labor proposition than, let's say, being a doctor or being a lawyer or literally being anything else. Okay, so just to kind of to explain what I mean is that when you're a doctor, being a doctor doesn't really change from office to office. Like the way a liver works, the medications that are there for livers, all these things are generally going to be the same. Like yes, there's going to be like new medicines that get approved, and you have to kind of keep up with journals, but your day to day doesn't really drastically change much. And if you were to go from one hospital to another, a lot of the main practices don't change. Like you may have some different equipment available to you. You may have availability to certain treatments and medicines a little bit more so at different hospitals, but the things that you would want to reach for are generally going to be the same. So in that case, experience plays a really big role because basically if you've done it one place, you can do it another because you're pretty much doing the exact same thing. Same thing with being a lawyer. If you're a lawyer in Missouri and then you become a lawyer in New York, the state laws change. This is true, but the federal laws don't. And if you go from like one part of Missouri to another part of Missouri, the state laws don't change. Maybe local ordinances do, but the idea is that the overall process of your job isn't, you're not undergoing as drastic a change. Okay, so basically, if you've done the job sort of in one place, you have like the core set of skills, you can kind of move around. Okay, and again with law, again there's different areas of law, but generally like you're specialized in one area and you stick to that one area. In web development, what happens is that just like within the web development space, like there's lots of areas of specialization, and you really can't just build a career in just one specialization. Like you can't just spend the next 30 years being a Ruby on Rails specialist. Like you might be able to spend like 4 or 5 years being a Ruby on Rails specialist, but problem is like technology changes so quick and the specializations change so rapidly, um, and then also like the mixes of technologies change. So like Ruby on Rails in one location maybe just be building APIs with a Postgres database, while another place you'll be using Ruby on Rails to build a full stack website. You're using ERB templates, and you might be using like MySQL as a database. And each of those, like you may have, even if you were doing like the former version of like Ruby on Rails for years, that shift to a slightly different use of Ruby on Rails will also still have a significant learning curve. Point being is that no matter what your experience is and no matter what your knowledge is in web development, anytime you take on a new role, the mix of technologies and practices can change, are so different, it's almost like restarting. Okay, so in that case, generally, it's not like most jobs where if you've done it in one place, you can go to another place and within a couple of weeks kind of be onboarded and up and running. Okay, or at least generally a lot quicker. In web development or just really in development as a whole. So whether you're doing like web development, mobile development, data engineering, whatever, okay, you're generally going to need like 90 days to ramp up at any job. Like you're not going to be able to put out little if any output in the first 90 days because one, there's like just the normal corporate onboarding stuff that you have to go through those first couple of days. Then you have to learn like all the company's rules and team practices and things like that, so that way you know sort of like how people work together. You gotta learn the code base and learn how the code base is structured. And again, if they're using a different language than you're used to, you might have to learn the language and learn about the technologies and the code base. So even if you know the technologies, there's still a learning curve with just understanding how they are applied in this particular project. Okay, like no matter how many times you've done a React project, if you look at another React project, you have to kind of spend some time learning like, okay, how were these components built and why were they built this way? What are these extra libraries that they brought in? Why did they bring them in? What is their role? You know, you don't just look at a fresh code base and just be like, oh yeah, this makes perfect sense. Okay. That's a little bit easier when you're using more robust frameworks like Angular or Ruby on Rails, where like the patterns vary a little bit less, but they can still vary quite a bit. Okay. So point is, like, developers are a little less plug and play than anything else. Even developers with the same set of skills. So like a developer that specializes in Angular is probably more plug and play than a developer in React, because React can get pretty diverse in how a React project looks like. But they're still not plug and play. Like there's still could be enormous differences between one Angular project and another. So with that being said, there's a lot of risk on the company hiring. Okay? And the problem is, like, developers aren't heterogeneous. So it's not like every developer knows Angular, every developer knows React, and every developer knows Go. And nor do they, even if two Angular developers may know Angular in different ways, they might have learned it in different angles, okay, and seen different patterns. Because really, like, the sky is the limit with a lot of these technologies, and they can be applied in 1,000 different ways. And there's no way to know every single way you can use it. Like, even the people who create these tools oftentimes don't anticipate the ways these technologies will be used. Okay, and they get surprised by how people use them. Okay, so point being is, like, it's just like this is such a wide net. Just looking for somebody who knows the exact technologies that you use currently isn't necessarily enough, because if you've ever worked on a project, you do know, like, you constantly have to bring in new technologies to solve new problems as they arise. So then your developers are going to have to learn those new technologies. And then some of the old technologies that you have currently, you might retire and replace with other ones. So you don't necessarily need someone who knows those tools, but can also demonstrate their ability to continue adapting and learning. Okay, because you need people who can grow with the company. And even an experienced developer, that can be sometimes hard to determine, because you might have someone who's like been experienced for like has 5 years of experience at one company, so they got really good at doing things that way that company does it. But it's been so long since they had to like adapt or shift or like really like learn a new set of technologies, that might still not be like a perfect match. And you won't know until after 90 days. Okay, so you're going to pay that person for 90 days before you find out if it's a right fit. And then not only is there the cost of you paying that person for 90 days, but there's also the fact that it's 3 months where you are not looking for someone. So people who might have been the right choice are now off the market. So there's a huge risk in actually hiring. Okay, and there's not really a good way to measure like things like adaptability. Like in a conversation, you're not able to learn how and really get a really good picture of how people learn. This is why the burden is really on you, the person who's applying, to paint that picture around you. Okay, this is what I always like to tell people. Like, if you just think like, hey, the interview should handle everything, and it's on the burden on the employer to have the right interview practices, you're leaving too much on the table. Okay, and you're depending too much on other people to figure out how to understand you. Okay, and if you want people to choose you, you need to make it easy for people to choose you. Okay, it's like, because at the end of the day, when you are looking for a job, you are the product. Okay, it's kind of like, if I were selling some sort of product and then I complained that the reason my product failed is because customers didn't evaluate my product correctly. They're like, oh, well, they didn't ask the right questions of my salespeople. Well, the burden shouldn't be on the potential customers to ask the right questions of your salespeople. It should be the job of your salespeople to present the right information that addresses that makes the value proposition clear. Okay, so in that case, the burden is on you to present your value to potential employers. And this goes to that point goes to any industry. And how can you do that? Okay, because again, we don't know if they're going to ask the right questions. We don't know if they're going to give the right coding challenges. But again, they're trying their best. But if you can provide the good additional context, you can circumvent bad questions and bad coding challenges. Okay, although again, a lot of that is not necessarily like bad. Okay, I mean, a lot of coding challenges may not necessarily be like feel like, oh, how does this apply to my day-to-day job? But it can be a clear indicator of how you think. A lot of questions may not be on like topics that you may know off the top of your head, but it can illustrate how you think about them when you're presented with information you don't know. Do you just try to pretend that you know it? Do you, try to explain what you do know and then be clear about what you don't know and what you would do to fill those gaps? Do you just freeze and say, I don't know, and not try to tackle with the idea or have any kind of thought process? Like, at the end of the day, they want to like see what your analytical thought process is. So, for example, if someone's told me some term that I may have not known once upon a time, like let me think of a example, when that you could kind of break down. Someone said like, oh, what's a graph database? Like, I know what a graph database is now, but once upon a time I didn't. I knew what a database was, so I can be like, well, a database is going to be one that stores data. And the database that I have worked with is a relational database that stores data in tables. And I know about object databases that store data as objects, documents and objects. Generally, when you think about like documents and collections, like a MongoDB. So while I haven't worked with a graph database, I imagine that a graph database stores the data differently and has different use cases. So, but as far as like what specifically a graph database is, I'd have to do more research, but I generally have an understanding of like how databases work and how you would connect to databases using code. So I imagine it would just be a matter of like learning sort of the specifics of that category. So that shows you that you have at least an understanding of the category of database, that you can draw trends and like you can pick up on trends, and also demonstrates like, okay, you have an idea of what you need to go out and learn. Like, based on these experiences with other categories of databases, I know, okay, these are probably the things I need to go figure out. Like, okay, how do I connect to the database? How do I ask it questions? Because it may not be the same way that I do it for an object or a relational database. And that's oftentimes what you need to know. Okay, at the end of the day, like, I haven't worked with every web framework, every backend web framework, but generally I know, because I've worked with a few, that generally what I need to figure out is like, how do you set up a route? How do you render a template with that route? Or how do I send back JSON data with that route? How do I set the cores? So why may not know how to do this in a specific framework? So like if you told me, let me think of what I haven't used yet, like how to do that in like Redwood JS, based on my experience with other frameworks, I know like these are questions that I'm going to want to go figure out. Okay, so you take what you know about something else in the same category, and you can be like, well, since this is what's important in this one, I can interpret that, hey, these are the things I need to go figure out and research. And that speaks a lot to sort of like your understanding of sort of like what the role of different tools are. Okay, again, the idea is having this high level understanding that sort of like where that you have a better idea of what you don't know. And honestly, the best way to get a good idea of that, my advice always is to try out multiple things. Like a lot of people say, oh, just focus on one language and one framework. Well, I do think it's good to invest a larger amount of time in one set of tools as far as developing sort of like your key stack, in a sense, like where your strength is, like whether it's React, whether it's like Express or something like that. But to use other varieties of that tools to get some exposure, because it becomes more clear, the category becomes more clear when, like, after having played with a React, Vue, Angular, Solid.js, Svelte.js, after playing with all 5 of those, I have a pretty clear idea of what a front-end framework in that category does or doesn't. So when someone presents to me some new project, like I'm trying to think like Voby.js, that I had to write an article on recently, I may have not worked with Voby.js in the past, and really, like, I don't think anyone has because it's really, really new. But I had a good idea of what to expect. Okay, and I had a good idea of what questions I need to kind of ask myself in assessing it. So that's why, and same thing with like backend frameworks. I've gone on my way to try out several different frameworks and build basic APIs with them, render basic templates, like do basic stuff. But you do that in different frameworks, you start getting an idea of like, okay, these things are always the same. These are the things that are different. Okay, that you can fill in those gaps. So generally, like that's my recommendation. Like when you're trying to learn to become more adaptable, that actually learning a variety of technologies, going shallow with many technologies, can be useful. But you also generally do want to have like something you commit to go deeper. Usually, I'd be more concerned with that at the language level. Okay. So if you're a web developer, then going really deep on JavaScript and knowing the language in and out, I think it's going to be more valuable than really going super deep on any particular framework. I'd actually prefer that you go shallow on several frameworks in different categories, so that way you understand the category better. Because then you'll be more adaptable when you're trying to talk through ideas and understand like the roles of things. Yeah. So point. Okay, so now so back. I was trying to get some like advice, and yes, like there's advice on how you learn, and that's kind of like how I think you can learn more effectively. This is why like generally I tell people just build a to-do list. Like anytime you have a new technology, build a to-do list. Don't try to create a different project in each technology because it's hard to compare what you did in framework A and framework B if you build two completely different apps. You build a to-do list every time, you know you're building the same app that works the same way, that applies the same patterns. So you're seeing how the pattern is applied or implemented in these different tools, which makes the tool and how the tool works more clear. Okay, it's like like scientific experiments. You have to have something that's a control, or else you can't compare anything, and it's kind of hard to derive and learn lessons from it. So on the learning path and trying to develop like the ability to talk, because one thing is learning these things and knowing what you want to learn, but two is developing the ability to talk about it, and that's where like creating content I think is really important. This is why generally I'm always a high evangelist of everyone starting a podcast. Again, it doesn't matter if anyone listens to your podcast. What matters is that you're documenting your ability to communicate. And while you're documenting it, you're improving your ability to communicate because you're communicating more often. Okay, the more I do this, the more I do these episodes of this show, which I appreciate you listening to, the better I'm getting at explaining these ideas. Okay, and actually sometimes something will just click in the middle of me explaining something. So you'll actually even learn in the process. Making videos, like if you watch my YouTube videos, a lot of those are actually done in the process of me learning. I learn something and then I make a video on it. One, it reinforces what I just learned, and two, it shows others, and again, it demonstrates that I learned the thing. And then the fact that I have so many videos demonstrates that I can quickly and aggressively learn, which again is going to be one of the key skills when you're being a developer. They want to know that hey, they can hire you, and you can kind of piece your way together. Because also like there's only so much room. Like some companies can definitely like foster you and grow you and kind of give you a hand in those early steps, but a lot of companies can't. A lot of mid to smaller companies, they need someone who can, they need to give time to, and they can give some light guidance to, but someone who can really kind of like go experiment and try to figure things out on their own. And then writing blogs. Okay, so basically showing how you write. And the cool thing about also just creating content, not only does it help you demonstrate that you can communicate, which also will help you during the interview to communicate. It'll give you a tool to demonstrate what you are, because you might totally freeze during the interview, but the fact that you have a video or a blog that they read, they may get a better idea. They may make the impression that you couldn't make during the interview or during the coding challenge. Okay, it can help fill in gaps that you failed to do in the hiring process. Again, you trying to make that value proposition of you easier to get. Okay. And then, of course, there's your cover letter. Okay, there's another thing that I think a lot of people take for granted. Like they use the cover letter to kind of like describe who they are, but I think they fail to understand like what is the key question you're trying to answer. Like, what is your value proposition? So if you're applying to a front end job, basically your cover letter should describe who you are, but also talk a little bit about what you think about the types of issues and solutions that you can provide in that space. Okay, so if I'm talking about like front end, talking about like, I started talking about like component-based, my appreciation for component-based design and how I find like encapsulation very interesting, and things of that to that level. And another side benefit of like creating content is that this also opens up a whole new career path for you, like as a developer advocate. Because there's a huge market right now. Like there's definitely like a need for people who can write quality content at the technical level. Because there's a lot of quality content, marketing content writers, but marketing content writers are not always technical. So oftentimes when you're trying to market towards a technical audience, you need someone who can communicate the technical aspects of things. And that's where the developer advocates come in. That's kind of like my current profession. And again, that became possible because I spent so much time making content and trying to figure out how to like talk to a technical audience and talk at a technical level in a way that anybody can understand. Okay, and that just came with practice. The more episodes, the more videos I did, the more podcast episodes I did, the more blogs I wrote, the easier it came for me to explain things. Okay, or to break things down. But yeah, so to summarize, okay, complaining about the hiring process doesn't fix the hiring process. Yes, it's not perfect by any means, and especially like job ads. Like job ads are just ridiculous in the sense where they're asking like 5 years of experience in technologies that haven't been around 5 years. That's more of an issue with like recruiters' understanding of the job positions, which is why I always tell people like, don't let a job description be your main deterrent to not applying for a job. Okay, apply, be honest in your application, but again, being being honest doesn't mean you don't sell yourself in the best light. Okay, you try to always sell yourself in the best light, because at the end of the day, like if you can't state your value proposition, then how is anybody else going to determine your value proposition? Think of you going to a store. It's not your job to understand which groceries you should buy or which things are appeal to you. The It's the job of anything that's on that shelf of the grocery store to make themselves appealing to you. Okay, so always when you're the seller, the burden's on you to make the case. And in this case, in the labor market, you are selling your labor to potential employers who are seeking to purchase labor. Okay, so it's up to you to market yourself. And while a resume and a cover letter and a portfolio go a long way, there's a lot more you can put on the table. And not doing those things like creating content, networking, things like that, you're leaving money on the table. You are not doing your full responsibility of marketing yourself and also being active on social media, basically being a visible, building a reputation around your expertise. And it's not like the reputation has to be positive in the sense that people like interacting with you. Like if you show that you put out a lot of really technical stuff, it's really, great. But if you're like a jerk to people and their comments on other people's posts, like, oh, well, you got that wrong. Like it's really this. That's also going to hurt you, because at the end of the day, most places you're going to work as a team. So demonstrating that like you can get along with people. So by being part of the grander developer community, you demonstrate that you can get along with others, you can communicate, you create content, you can demonstrate your technical ability and that you can communicate, and all these things mentioned on your cover letter, because again, don't expect them to find your content, and also in your portfolio. Just because you have a portfolio, don't just let them explore in your cover letter, like explain like where they should go to your portfolio to make the points that you want to make. So like actually have links in your cover letter being like, well, I have worked with this and done this, which is demonstrated by this application that I built, and then link to that part of your portfolio so they can go there. Like again, the idea is to curate and deliver that value proposition and serve it up to the person who you want to make a particular decision. And this is everything in life, not just job hunting. Okay, you want someone else. You can't control the decisions other people make, nor should you. But what you can do is make it easier for people to make the decisions you think they should make by giving them the information they need to go in that direction. By making sure that they understand their needs. Okay, so talking about like, hey, what is the challenges in hiring? So in this case, like talk to like what is the challenges in hiring a good front-end developer, let's say. It's like a lot of front-end, like as a front-end developer, sometimes there can be people who have a difficult time working in teams, or who don't understand how to structure their components well, or disorganized state. Because of this, I have focused in these areas, and here are some examples of how I focused in these areas, so that way I can solve the problems that will help you in your company provide value. Okay, because at the end of the day, like a job is not just like a thing. Like the idea is that like somebody needs something valuable done, and they're hoping that if they pay you $40, that you're going to give them, $60 worth of value. Okay, because I wouldn't pay you $40 for $40. Like then I'm no longer like I might as well just done nothing. So you need to come in there with the mindset that you provide that value and be able to communicate that you do. And you have to think about what the problem is, think about what is the solution, and think about how can you clarify that you provide that solution. And you have a lot of avenues to do that, but it's your choice to take advantage of those avenues. So if you don't, that's on you. My name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Yeah, share this episode with your friends who are also maybe going through, looking for their first developer job or something like that. And because I think a lot of this advice can be really useful for many people entering the developer labor market. And have a great day and enjoy.